You're most likely to recognize The Lord of the Rings as the epic fantasy film trilogy directed by Peter Jackson. You might also know that the movies were based on three novels written by J.R.R. Tolkien, one continuous story written as a follow-up to Tolkien's previous work, The Hobbit. But what you may not know is that before Peter Jackson hit big with his adaptation, an animated version of the classic story was made. It was directed by Ralph Bakshi, who at the time was known for making animated urban films geared towards adults. His first attempt at fantasy was actually with the 1977 film Wizards. A year later, he attempted to adapt the entirety of Tolkien's story into one movie, but was unable to do so. We'll get into that in a little bit. If you're even a little bit familiar with Lord of the Rings, you should understand the basic gist. Frodo, a hobbit, is entrusted by the wizard Gandalf to keep the One Ring of Power away from the Dark Lord Sauron, who wishes to conquer Middle-earth. It soon comes to the conclusion at the Council of Elrond in the land of Rivendell that Frodo will continue to be targeted by the Black Riders as long as the ring is still in his possession. The only way to destroy it, which they'll need to do in order to stop the rule of Sauron, is to drop it in Mount Doom in the land of Mordor where it was created. There's more backstory to it than that, but you get the basic idea. To state one of the most obvious positives with this film, the animation is really smooth. A lot of it has to do with the extensive use of rotoscoping, where basically they first shoot live actors on the set and draw over it to create the feeling of realistic animation. In the modern day, this is done through CGI in live action films, but back then, it was almost unheard of, at least to this extent and so realistically. Most of the time, especially with the orcs, it looks really cool. However, it looks weird when they do it on human characters, especially in that scene at the prancing pony. Seeing their faces like that just feels off. The changes in style are a little distracting. But at the same time, I'm just impressed at how this was all done in 1978. And also, sometimes the two styles are mixed together, giving an equally impressive result. The facial expressions can be a little overly exaggerated though. It doesn't happen often. But trust me, the images will be burnt into your memory even after you die. But for the most part, the animation is not the usual cartoonish nature of movement. This one moves more like a live-action film. But this film was not all sparkles and sunshine, as many fans of the Peter Jackson trilogy and even the books have proven. One of the biggest issues I personally have with the movie is with the editing. It's pretty sloppy in a lot of places. Half the time you're not even expecting a scene change and boom, next scene, with absolutely no segue whatsoever. The characters are talking about going to Lothlorien, then we start to hear the voice of Galadriel, then we immediately cut to Lothlorien. What kind of budget cuts were they on during the animation process? I know that the budget is not as big as in the Peter Jackson films, but sometimes there is scenes of walking from one place to another, so have some flow to it and a little bit of consistency. Speaking of inconsistency, when Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli seek aid from King Theoden, we see in one shot that Gandalf is dressed in his first set of clothes, gray cloak and blue hat. Then the next shot we see him back in white, like he was when he met back up with the other three. Did anyone ever catch that mistake? How on Middle-earth could that have passed the test screening? But in all honesty, I'd be more mad if this lasted through the whole scene as opposed to just one shot. Another example, sometimes the character Saruman is referred to as Aruman. They dropped the S. That's because the producer thought that Sauron and Saruman sounded too similar and wanted to change the name. But when writer Peter S. Beagle was rewriting the shooting script, he kept insisting that they just stop dropping the S. Really wish that advice went full circle because the finished product uses both names. If you're not familiar with the books, you're going to get confused. The musical score is not quite as memorable as the epic Howard Shore music. It just sounds like generic music you'd hear in just about any other epic fantasy film. It doesn't have to be animated, most of them would be live action anyway. I mean real live action, not this rotoscoping stuff. When it comes to famous scenes from Lord of the Rings, it's hard not to mention the scene where Gandalf encounters the Balrog. You know the one I'm talking about. Thou shalt not pass! This scene doesn't seem as effective in the animated film. Sure, it's the same deal. Gandalf busts the bridge so the Balrog could fall down, despite it having wings, and gets taken down with it. While he falls, he delivers the line, "Fly, you fools!" which comes off as more of unintended humor than a genuine sacrifice. In the Peter Jackson film, the line delivery was strange, but it still felt like a great and honorable mentor falling to his doom. But here, it just comes off as awkward. Next, I want to address Gollum. I'm not really sure how to feel about his design. He looks more like Groot, fused with a human skeleton. I get the idea that he's a hobbit whose appearance has changed to something hideous in the years he had the ring, but the Gollum we see in the Peter Jackson films, in my opinion, will always be the true Gollum to me. Another odd thing about him is his voice. It's not all intimidating, though at the back of the throat like Andy Serkis was attempting, but more of a cowardly soul constantly fearing for his life, and half the time he sounds like Goofy. I promise, that's my last comparison to the Jackson films. The most infamous thing about this movie is how abruptly it ends. It was during an intense battle scene when Rohan and his armies are fighting the orcs, then Gandalf arrives with his armies to drive the orcs away. Immediately after, the film stops and narration tells us that this was actually a two-parter. At this point, they only covered Fellowship of the Ring and half of the Two Towers. Both fans and newcomers were upset because it's not like it was labeled as part 1. It was just simply called The Lord of the Rings, as if it was the entire story in one feature. Remember, there was no internet back then, meaning you had no idea how long the movie would be. But let me tell you, if this film was released today, I'd know for sure we wouldn't get the whole story in 133 minutes, and if we did, the pacing would be way too fast. The fault of the marketing was on the executives of United Artists, who wanted to drop the part 1 because they thought nobody in their right minds would pay to see half the story. This upset Bakshi immensely because people expect the entirety of the story and they don't get it. But the damage was done. While the film was a financial hit, due to the harsh negativity toward the film and Bakshi's contention with the executives, a part 2 for the story was never made, though not necessarily by Bakshi. The year before this, Rankin Bass made an animated TV movie for The Hobbit, then a couple years after Bakshi's version, made an animated TV version of Return of the King, which should hopefully close up the story pretty well despite the different animation style. So yeah, this film is far from perfect. It definitely has its issues. But that doesn't mean this film is bad. It's actually a pretty decent watch. While the editing seems to be all over the place and emotional moments are somehow turned awkward, it can charm you with its smooth animation, and the epic battle scenes are sure to cause some form of excitement. It leaves a lot of stuff from the books out of this feature, but I don't mind too much. I can understand if there are people who don't like this film. Obviously, the Peter Jackson films are superior, but be sure to give this a try. Even if you're disappointed, at least there's something there that can give off a positive feel.